I'm Pilar Marrero, Associate Editor for American Community Media, formerly Ethnic Media Services. President Trump ran for office promising mass deportations, vowing to make America safer by removing criminal immigrants. But enforcement in the past few months has gone far beyond border crossers or criminals. Legal residents, visa holders, tourists, and even visa applicants have been detained. Humanitarian protections like TPS, temporary protected status, and parole have been revoked, putting hundreds of thousands at risk of being deported back home to countries they fled for their lives. Hundreds have been secretly transferred to third countries like El Salvador and Panama, what experts call illegal renditions, sparkling legal battles. Meanwhile, immigrants are being forced to register. The IRS is pressured to expose the undocumented, and green cards are revoked over political views. Even social media is now scrutinized in naturalization cases. Our legal experts will break down these sweeping changes and explain your rights. Our guests today are Zenobia Lai, Executive Director at Houston Immigration Legal Services Collaborative, David Leopold. He's the past president of the American Immigration Lawyers Association and a partner at UB Greensfelder LLP in Cleveland, Ohio. Todd Schulte, president of Forward.us, and Martin Kim, director of immigration advocacy at AAJC in the District of Columbia in DC. We are honored to have you all here today. Reporters, please enter your questions in the chat, but we will hold the questions until every speaker has answered my questions. We're going to have sort of a Q&A today. And some of the questions that you come up with may be answered by another speaker. So be patient and then come up with your questions towards the end. So we begin with Zenobia. Welcome. Zenobia, I want to ask you about the administration's actions targeting the undocumented or status seekers, both at the border and inside the country. What kinds of tactics are they using to get their hands on this population that are different or more intense than before? One example might be the suspension of asylum applications or the targeting of sensitive locations. You have 4 minutes for that. Thank you.
Okay, let me share the PowerPoint so that it's easier to follow. Okay, yeah. So I'm going to talk about the immigration policy changes since January 20th, which is the inauguration day. And I can lump the operating principles into kind of three buckets. The first one is let no one in. The second one is kick everyone out. And the third one is shut the back door. So I'll go over these one by one. Let no one in. So during the first day of this administration, there were like 26 executive orders issued, about at least 7 of them directly targeting immigration. Declare a national emergency, calling the inflation, and the Department of Homeland Security found mass influx and renewed the finding again just a few days ago to justify the call of national emergency and to expand the use of war power by the president. And then direct all the different military and other federal law enforcement agencies to go to the border to enforce immigration, basically on the deportation side, and to expand what we call the Section 287G agreement with state and local law enforcement agencies to deputize immigration enforcement locally. So you mentioned about the asylum ban. That's part of the letting no one in. Shut down the CBP-1 app, which is the only mechanism, even under the Biden administration, for asylum seekers to make an appointment at the port of entry so that they can come in to apply for asylum. So CBP-1 app was shut down around noon of inauguration day. So people have waited for 6 months for finally have an appointment. All of a sudden, all the appointments are canceled. Tens of thousands of people are sort of lost and stuck on the other side of the border. And the second part is, no one can apply for asylum if they show up. So there is no asylum possible from asylum seekers coming into the country. And continue to build a wall and resume the migrant protection protocol. Details are not being set up yet, but that is definitely the plan. And on the inauguration day, also one of the executive orders to suspend refugee resettlement. Even though the executive action was supposed to be effective a week later, but people who waited for 2 or 3 years, passed through all the vetting processes, they have flights scheduled, all the flights were canceled. So thousands of people were stuck and have to either resume the process or just in limbo. So that's part of the letting no one in. So so that part is sort of, almost done, right? So now we go to the second part, which is to kick everyone out. Using the war power to use the antiquated Alien Enemies Act of 1798 to do secret rendition, round up Venezuelan nationals and send them over to El Salvador, expel hundreds of people to Panama and basically detain them in a hotel unlawfully and then send them over to the camp just north of the Darien Gap for them to figure out the way back, to go back the other way around on the Darien Gap. And there's litigation going on the 3 planes that were sent to El Salvador under the Alien Enemies Act. And the government is using the state secrets as a defense to not turn over immigration. And the third one is we are hearing that a lot in the last couple of weeks. Students who might have voiced their opinion about the war in Gaza, and they were kidnapped off the street by immigration enforcement in plain clothes and masks. So that is very scary. That's tactics going on. And under the administration of expanded expedited removal, meaning that basically everyone who cannot prove that they've been in the U.S. for 2 years will be subject to expedited removal. And stripping temporary protection status for Venezuelans and Haitians, and the parole for Cubans, Haitians, Nicaraguans, and Venezuelans. Deny due process left and right, and I think David will talk more about this later on. And criminalizing unlawful presence. Unlawful presence is a civil violation of the immigration law, and now, they want to make it a crime. More on kicking everyone out, rescinding a sensitive location, which is a policy that's been, a guiding principle for immigration enforcement for the last decade. So now exposing schools, places of worship, hospitals, playgrounds, funeral, weddings, protests, courts, to immigration enforcement. And in order to pick everyone out, also need to target the helpers so that there's no one to help immigrants through suspending funding. First, initially was sanctuary jurisdiction, but then it's also targeting legal services that provide immigration assistance through multiple stop work orders. Federal funding freeze, even though the court ordered the federal government to release the funds, it has not been fully released. And then go after big law firms and immigration lawyers. And encourage collaboration between state and federal government to enforce immigration. And data sharing that you mentioned earlier, data sharing between Office for Refugee Resettlement and ICE, OR administered Unaccompanied Children program. So it will enforce, sharing data of the custodians of these unaccompanied children, sharing data between Homeland Security and Housing and Urban Development, and sharing data between Homeland Security and IRS in the final stages. So data sharing is to identify where, people are so that, they can go after them. And more kicking everyone out, decimate legal access by, sending people in secret flights to Guantanamo Bay, where lawyers cannot access the clients cannot access any legal services. And then ramp up investigation and audit of federally funded programs that serve immigrants. This is not just legal services. And destroying administrative agencies still ongoing, laying off fake IL, firing federal employees. The latest round is to lay off 10,000 employees of Department of Health and Human Services. And scare tactics, to deter access to safety net programs, which is, if you all remember, in 2019, that's the public charge regulation that threatens mixed status families and adults if they access benefits program for their eligible children. If in the future they may have a way to regularize their status, they may not be able to. Extreme vetting, potential custodians for unaccompanied children, requiring, all the household members over 18 years old of the custodians to subject to fingerprinting, meaning that, no one is going to be able to come forward to claim these children, causing extended detention of unaccompanied children. And DHS also have this multi-million ad campaign, locally and also internationally, and have already repurposed the CBP1 app that was used for asylum seekers to make appointments to become a CBP home app, so that they encourage people to leave now. If you don't leave, we'll find you and deport you. And hunting down unaccompanied children, children that might have missed the court dates or failed to depart after they receive a voluntary departure order under the guise of wellness check.
You have 1 minute.
Okay. So this is part of take everyone out and also closing the back door. The denying birthright citizenship, that was one of the very early executive order of this administration, denying children born to parents who can, mothers and fathers who don't have permanent immigrant status to become citizens at birth. So this is a violation of a well-established 127-year legal precedent. The Supreme Court has spoken in 1898. Children born on the soil of the United States are citizens by birth, regardless of the parents' immigration status. So there are 9 lawsuits on this issue and 5 injunctions. Part of this is to not only to take away the citizenship of the children to be born, but also close the back door so that, when these children turn 21, they have no ability to petition for their parents. So this is where things are at. More than 100 lawsuits filed, and these are just some of the highlights. Birthright citizenship, I talked about it, federal funding freeze, and refugee suspension. And the latest one is the stop work order last Friday, exactly 1 week ago, to stop ordering unaccompanied children legal services to stop work. A lawsuit was filed this Wednesday, so it's winding in the court process. So I'll pass it on to the next speaker.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Zenobia. And if we can have a copy of that presentation, that would be great, because that's a great summary. So we can send it out to our reporters. Please send it to us. Okay. All right. Well, thank you for that great summary. And we're going to move on before we have more discussion. We now welcome Todd Schulte. He's president of the organization Forward.us. And Mr. Schulte, beyond targeting the broader undocumented population, the administration is also going after other groups of people that are using legal pathways. Some of these populations were already living here legally in the country. I'm talking about TPS for several different nationalities and CHNV for Cubans, Haitians, Nicaraguans, and Venezuela. A parole program that accepted over 500,000 people that were vetted, had sponsors, and were living legally in the country. They had been told that they need to leave within a month. Please tell us your take on this, and what do you expect the effect to be of these attacks on legal pathways?
I think that last presentation did such a good job capturing the depth and the breadth in such a digestible way of so many of the fast assaults we are seeing on immigrants in an immigration system. And I'm just going to kind of go through on this last point. We heard so much during the campaign, really to go back 9.5 years since President Trump came down the escalator and made really important comments about at that time, Mexicans. We saw in the first campaign around Muslims. We have seen this effort to kind of expand this depenalization, that's what I'll talk about later, this trap of criminalizing folks there. But let me talk for a second about people who have legal status in this country and why it is so important that people should have the ability to keep the status that they have. So let's talk about that. So the first category you mentioned here is people who came to the country via a parole pathway, a legal pathway that was created for them by the United States. What you saw, in an effort to take existing legal tools in a failed immigration system, was an effort in the last administration to use these parole pathways. Parole authority has gone back 7 decades. It's been used by every president of every single party. And it is an effort to provide people the ability to have deportation protection, to enter the country legally, and the ability to work while they're here. And I think that's really important. People should be able to have the ability to work, to live their lives without the fear of daily deportation for some period of time. And these parole efforts have been a tremendous success. Taking the lessons learned with the very chaotic withdrawal from Afghanistan there, but parole providing a life-saving way for people to flee the Taliban. For 250,000 Ukrainians who entered through the Uniting for Ukraine program to be able to come to the United States. What you saw in 2023 was an effort to create for Cuba, Haiti, Nicaragua, and Venezuela, the CHNV parole pathways, and also the CB1 pathways at the border, where instead of people going between ports of entry as their sole means to enter and apply for asylum, they could go and they could enter the U.S. and then subsequently apply for asylum. These programs have been a tremendous...
Slow down a bit for the interpreters, sorry.
Sorry, let me
slow down a bit for the interpreters. Thank you.
So these parole pathways have been a tremendous success. There are around 900,000 people, 500,000 of those people who have this CHNV parole. So that stands for Cuba, Haiti, Nicaragua, and Venezuela. The results of these programs were, 1, people were able to come to the country in a safe and orderly fashion. 2, these people were vetted. They are sponsored by someone in the United States. And 3, they're able to work. And what you saw is it reduced pressure at the border. And they were a key part of building these legal pathways that led to a huge reduction in unauthorized border crossings. These were the countries where the most number of people were going between ports of entry. And now during 23 and 24, the numbers of people who didn't have a line available showing up. So we as a country asked people to come in, and we are now stripping that status away. And that's absolutely the wrong approach. These 500,000 people should have the ability to work, and I will talk for a second about another, which is temporary protected status. So TPS, or temporary protected status, is something that has been, again, used by presidents in both parties going back many decades. There's over 1 million people who have a temporary protected status, many of them from Venezuela, from Haiti, people from El Salvador, who in many of these cases, people have been living in the United States for decades. It is clear in statute it's not safe to return these people there. And again, this gives people the ability to work and to fully contribute there. It is something that is really, really, really important. DACA is another program that provides this temporary status. And so as we look forward to the next couple of years, we should be a country that not only keeps people in these statuses, but we should be building towards a permanent status. Now, if that's not going to happen, we shouldn't be throwing people into chaos. And it's not just people who have these temporary statuses. You have seen this, and I want to be really clear. You have seen people who have no status coming under increased risk and chaos, and that hurts all Americans. People with a temporary status, whether it's TPS or parole, whose lives are being thrown into chaos. Many of these people, hundreds of thousands of these people with U.S. citizen children, with U.S. citizen spouses. You've seen people on other sorts of visas, work visas, H-1B visas. You've seen people with a green card. Look at the student situation at Tufts here. You have seen efforts not just to slow down these processes, but you've seen talk of denaturalization. You have seen talk of trying to and you've seen efforts to executively amend and change the 14th Amendment's guarantee of birthright citizenship. The last thing I will say is this. Often what starts around rhetoric, around people with no status, which starts with kind of rhetoric that attempts to cast people in unflattering lights, expands to everybody here. And so as we talk later, I'm sure, about many of the concerns with people who are being caught up in things like the Alien Enemies Act, which was last used against U.S. citizens of Japanese, German, and Italian descent in World War II. I think it's really important to keep in mind what starts as comments about undocumented immigrants expands out from there. It wouldn't be good if it just started there. So I appreciate the opportunity to talk about people with a legal status and these threats against them.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Schulte. Thank you for being with us. We now move on to David Leopold. He's a past president of the American Immigration Lawyers Association and a practicing immigration attorney in Cleveland. David, I want you to talk about due process. Due process seems to be lacking in many cases. Can you please talk about this and clarify how the administration is using ancient laws such as the alien enemies or the registry law to do extraordinary things, like, for example, send a number of people to countries like El Salvador and ending up with a tense back and forth with the federal judge? You need to unmute, David.
Sorry about that. Don't ever hire me as your tech guy. Thank you, Pilar, and thank you, everybody. Thanks for having me. So yeah, I'm glad you framed the question that way, Pilar, because it's spot on. I think the through line here with all of this, whether it's what Todd just said or Zenobia pointed out in her extensive coverage, this is about due process. And taking all of these complicated laws together is an abridgment and an encroachment, and ultimately, if we continue to let it go, a destruction of American due process, our core values as we've known them. So let me go specifically. The Alien Enemies Act. So what's going on with the Alien Enemies Act? Let's step back. This act was last used during World War II. It's what led to the incarceration, the internment of Japanese Americans, both of Japanese descent and citizenship, into internment camps. So it's got a long sordid history for which President Ronald Reagan actually apologized. So this is the first time it's been used. Now, why is it being used? It's being used to, as far as I can tell, to make good on a campaign promise to remove Venezuelans who the president claims were gang members. We all heard that rhetoric during the campaign. So now we see immigration policy by rhetoric. Effectively, what this does, and the reason due process is so horribly implicated here, is that it completely bypasses, it completely cuts off, circumvents the administrative removal, deportation apparatus that we have in the United States. We can debate for another day whether the immigration system, the deportation system needs to be reformed. That's a whole nother debate, but it's there. And it is designed, as imperfect as it is, to protect due process, meaning the government has the obligation to prove its case. So if it's a gang member or somebody's been convicted of a gang-related crime, they've got to prove the crime. They've got to prove membership. They've got to go into court with proof. When the Alien Enemies Act is invoked, we can get to whether it's properly invoked or not, and I will in a second, but when the Alien Enemies Act is invoked, all that's got to happen is that somebody's got to be Venezuelan and a member of the gang. Then they're liable to be removed. That's how simple it gets. They completely circumvent. I'll get to the legality of that in just a second. But the point I'm trying to make is there's no due process. There's no right to contest. Somebody can't, there's no way. And we saw this poor fellow in the prison in El Salvador, in this terrorism center down there, that horrific place, crying and saying he was not a gang member. He was a makeup artist. These are people, others who've applied for asylum seekers, never committed a crime. Why are they there? Because they didn't have the right to contest what the government was going to do. So it's monarchical, unilateral power in the executive and the president to decide as judge, jury, that somebody's part of a gang or somebody's part of a class that he doesn't want in the country and remove them, completely circumventing due process. Now, the actual invocation of the act itself is seriously, it requires a declared war. Do we have a declared war against Venezuela? Not that I last saw. Or it requires an invasion by that country. Do we have an invasion by Venezuela? And even assuming, you'd still have to have connection between the Maduro regime and TDA, the Trinidad. Do we have it? So you can use the statute cynically to do, apparently that's what's being done here, is using these terms that are being thrown around not only during the campaign but all the time, of invasion and gangs and all this sort of thing, and turn it into policy, and in the meantime completely depriving these folks who've been removed, whether they're gang members or not. Nobody on this call, nobody in this country, as far as I know, wants dangerous gang people in the country. But people have a right. People have a right to due process. People have a right to defend themselves. People have a right to be heard. And that's the serious implication here. And it's starting with folks who are not citizens. And you mentioned the Registry Act. I assume you mean the invocation of the invocation of the policy that folks have to register with federal government. That's always been in the law. People have always had registration obligations, but it's never been used as a cudgel to make people into criminals, to force people to use it as an example, or to use it as a tool to criminalize somebody who simply forgets to write down where they're living or where they're from or whatever. And it's a very cynical approach to the administration of immigration policy. If you get into the recent announcement earlier in the week that ICE is cooperating or getting IRS, the Internal Revenue Service, to turn over records. Think about that for a second. Number one, the rhetoric has always been during the campaign before that undocumented immigrants are taking advantage of Americans, living off the country, not paying their taxes. Well, the screaming headline from this last week should have been immigrants pay their taxes, and the government admits it. Because why else would they be going to IRS to get the information? So logically, it doesn't even make any sense. From a privacy perspective, it's devastating, not only to the immigrants, but to everybody, lawful permanent, anybody who pays taxes, because all of a sudden we're going to have bureaucrats going through our tax files. And how do they know whether John Doe A is different than John Doe B is different? People have the same names across the board. So inevitably, we're going to have problems. Just like we're going to have mistakes. We're going to have people who are victimized by this enforcement mechanism. The same way we
1 minute. 1 minute, please.
People removed who shouldn't have been removed. So the through line here is due process. And when you abridge the due process rights, when you cut due process to increase the power of the executive, of the law enforcer, this touches us all. So this isn't just about immigrants, undocumented, documented, lawful permanent residents. The through line to U.S. citizenship and the U.S. citizens in this country is clear.
Thank you, David. Let's move on to Martin Kim, Director of Immigration Advocacy at AAJC in DC. Hi, Martin, welcome. There are increasing arrests of people going through their immigration appointments and collateral damage, where some are arrested when ICE looks for someone else, despite legal agreements that forbid this activity. Can you talk about these tactics and share your reactions to them in the communities you serve?
Yes, and thank you for that question. I do want to piggyback a little bit off of what some of the other speakers have been saying, and point out that a lot of these tactics, the breadth and depth of these attacks on immigrant communities, the changes, they're overwhelming. It's hard for our community to keep up with these changes, and that's deliberate. It's meant to sow fear and confusion in immigrant communities across the U.S. And to be clear, some of the tactics that you're talking about, right, collateral arrests of folks going to their immigration appointments, Immigration and Customs Enforcement, ICE, has always been a rogue agency, and some of the tactics you're talking about have occurred in the past. That's why advocates and lawyers have sought to restrict how and when ICE could use certain tactics, right? But now, under President Trump, under the second administration, what we've seen is that they are taking away some of the restrictions on this rogue agency on immigration enforcement. And what we've seen is immigration enforcement that, to echo what David is saying, does not care about due process, does not care about the rights of immigrants, but also does not care about the rights of citizens, and doesn't care about the well-being of our communities more generally, right? We can take another example from the first presentation about this rescission of the sensitive locations policy, right? This is a long-standing common sense policy around barring immigration enforcement from entering schools, hospitals, places of worship, right? This makes sense. We want to make sure that people feel safe accessing education, healthcare, in worship. But this was removed by this Trump administration. And not only that, it was replaced with rhetoric about needing to go into those spaces, to go after immigrants in those spaces, right? This is all, I think, a reminder that even once Trump is no longer in office, we will need real reforms to make sure this kind of stuff doesn't happen again. And this is actually under this administration, we can really see day by day how the weakening of rights for immigrant communities, for disfavored communities, has led to the weakening of rights for everyone. To talk about that a little bit more, ICE officers have already erroneously detained some U.S. citizens, right? That happened before Trump, but under Trump, this has been happening and without shame, right? We've also seen targeting of, as you mentioned, people with green cards, people who are here on valid student visas. We're seeing attacks in another direction, as was mentioned earlier. Community organizations are having trouble continuing to provide vital services like English language education, citizenship workshops, and legal assistance because of the grant freezes and terminations. All that is to say is these attacks, these tactics, they've existed before the Trump administration, but we've really seen an escalation under Trump in a way that has created fear and confusion in our communities.
Thank you so much. You mentioned, and there's a question in the chat, and I'm going to take the advantage of that question to talk to you about this. There's a question from Fatma Bakhit about the arrest and taking away green cards or visas from students. I read a piece today that said Marco Rubio had said he's already taken away 300. We've only known about 3 or 4 students that have been arrested so far. You know, a Turkish student, a South Korean student, and so on. The other couple of students. So what they're doing is punishing people, punishing immigrants for having a political opinion by taking away their visa or their green card. What is the slippery slope here? What can we go? I mean, I don't think any administration has done this before. Have they?
So I don't know if I have the answer to that last question, but to talk about like what you're referring to in terms of a slippery slope, I mean, this is something, some of the laws that have been invoked by this administration are laws that remain on the books, right? We're talking about the Alien Enemies Act. There's a provision of the Immigration and Nationality Act about the right to deport people based on foreign policy considerations. These are laws that exist. As to whether they're legal, constitutional, you know, there are lawsuits on that. There are cases that are being decided in the courts about that right now, right? But all this is to say, this demonstrates the way in which, because the Trump administration is going, you know, they framed their enforcement efforts as going after a certain class of individuals, certain people, maybe with connections or interactions with the criminal legal system, right? And that's there wasn't enough pushback against that. We see the same tools then being used against other populations, even in some cases erroneously against US citizens, right? So to go back to what other folks have said, due process is really important. Advocating for the rights of all immigrants, regardless of how you might feel about, for example, their political opinion, that's extremely important because of what might happen to other people, right? What might happen to US citizens. and lawful permanent residents and others.
Got you. Okay, so let's take some questions in the chat because there's quite a few. Hold on. So Peter, you had a question regarding how lasting the changes are. You want to ask your question for anyone in the panel that wants to answer it. Do you want to ask
Yeah.
it, Peter?
Yeah, thank you, Pilar, and thank you to the panelists for the presentation today. I guess I'm curious, I assume we all probably know that a lot of the steps that the Trump administration is taking are being done through executive action. And so my question is just how lasting are these changes going to be with respect to immigration policy? And hypothetically, if the Democrats retake the House, as is being discussed, how much of this can be sort of stopped or reversed? Thank you.
Anyone? I think Todd,
I
you
would venture, yeah,
also.
I would venture to say that, this is actually the Project 2025 playbook, right? To throw out a lot of stuff in a very short time span to overwhelm the nonprofit community and justice advocates, right? So there are more than 100 cases filed in court, but the legal process is slow, right? Even though we have a lot of injunction and temporary restraining orders issued, the administration is like, oh, okay, they are not even obeying the court order, right? So a lot of these terrible illegal action probably would stay on for some time, even if, quote, Democrats can retake the House, in the future. So, but by then, a lot of the damage has already been done. We may not be able to reverse a lot of the bad stuff. So that is very important for you all in the media to really publicize what is going on, with the immigration realm. Because I don't know if the general public actually know what is going on. Even though there is like the last poll is like 50-60% of the people support the immigration policy. But exactly what has the immigration policy been, I'm not sure people understand. And as Martin mentioned earlier, and David also talked about this too, this is entirely a slippery slope. Well, the administration said they're going after criminals. They have not been just going after criminals. And actually, the people that are detained, at least half of them have absolutely no criminal record. And for those that have, quote, criminal records, we're talking about traffic violations. And I'm not supporting, letting serious criminals to be out roaming about. I am not saying that. But so-called people with criminal issues are not the ones that we want the administration to target, right? But now we are also seeing that, visa holder, people who are lawfully present in the United States also being targeted, being snatched off the street. And green card cannot be revoked without due process. You cannot just rip up the card and say, sorry, you don't have lawful permanent resident status anymore. But this is the problem, right? This administration has ignored this whole, due process, foundational principle of our rule of law.
Thank you. Todd, go ahead.
Yeah, I think just to pick up on a couple themes, I think if you look at the Alien Enemies Act, it ties together a couple of things, and a lot of things can be true at once. So the first thing I think is the Alien Enemies Act exists in the law. That said, there should be no effort to ever use the Alien Enemies Act today or in the future. There should be no effort to use it against anyone, regardless of status, whether they're an adult or, in this case, explicitly allowed children. Like, this is allowed to go after children. We've talked about how it was used in the past, but again, it was used against the majority of people used at the time, LPRs and citizens. No one should be subjected to this. And I think it's really important to understand this isn't a question of a means of deportation. We've heard terms like disappearances and renditions. That is much more accurate. We are, as a country, arresting people and secretly sending them away to another country where they are not from, where they are being incarcerated in one of the most abhorrent prisons in the world. There is no place for this in any sort of a even failed immigration system. And we do have a failed immigration system. Now, it also exposes a lot of the false pretenses that we need to be careful about. And we need to take those head on so that when we come out of this, these aren't lasting powers that exist. So what do I mean by that? Number one, we cannot allow it to be okay that a president invokes wartime powers by using things like an invasion. We are not, in fact, at war with Venezuela. Okay, we should be very clear about that. Venezuela has not invaded the United States and taken over large amounts of territory. So that is false. Migration is not an invasion. Certainly the act of people seeking refuge is absolutely not an invasion here. Two, this is like a serious escalation. These are the sorts of actions that don't exist in functional democracies, these sorts of disappearances. Because three, due process is sacrosanct. It is very important. It is not enough. We should not be treating people terribly, even if they get due process. That due process alone would not fix a failed criminal justice system or failed legal system, but it is a very, very important part of it. The last thing I just want to say is what you're seeing here exposes so many of the traps of demagoguery, the traps of criminalization here, that this administration is not even able in its opening days to put forth rhetoric that matches its policies here. I think exposes that we all need to guard very carefully when people say they're just going after certain sorts of people who they want to pick a political fight with, whether those are people who've had contact with the criminal justice system, whether this is people who are from a certain country, all of these things here. This sort of criminalization is a trap. And instead, what we have to do to get back to this point of the immigration system we want, and the lasting thing is we need to show people a better path forward. The public was unhappy with what they saw as a chaotic border. Let's have a secure immigration system. The American public, I do not believe, supports large-scale ramp-ups and deportations of people in the United States. Let's build the case for a pathway to citizenship. And that's how we don't end up with this being the sort of thing that 10 or 20 years from now, we're sitting here digging out of.
Okay, let's move on because there's more questions. Maybe David can answer this. What is going to happen? Okay, Jose, I'm going to ask the question for you just to go faster. What is going to happen with the people with EU visas? What's your guess, David?
Well, I mean, look, I think anybody, EU visa is for folks who are witnesses and cooperating in criminal investigations, just so folks know.
Yes.
Look, I think anybody who is on any kind of visa, or anybody who is not a citizen, meaning a lawful permanent residence, are in a very precarious moment. And the country has learned collectively that that those types of statuses, whether it's permanent, whether it's temporary, whether it's professional, whether it's law enforcement related, are all subject to question and to being canceled and to folks being picked up and removed. We've seen chilling pictures of students taken off the street, and as pointed out earlier, people disappeared and people sent to rendered is the term I think is more appropriate, to foreign countries. This is something that we have not ever seen, at least in my lifetime. And it's a very, very dark moment in the time in history. And I think that I think what we need to understand is that immigrants are the tip of the spear. And the aim is for our collective rights in this country, our civil liberties. What are being offended here are core American values. America, as Todd just articulately stated, we don't render people to foreign countries for imprisonment. That's not what we do here. We have a due process system. It's enshrined in our Constitution. Nobody wants dangerous people running around. We have systems to take care of that. But to take a group and point at a group, as was done during the campaign, and imply that this entire group is criminal or this entire group is bad, the other. This reminds many of us of the darkest moments of the 20th century in the 30s, where people were targeted that way. And we know where this can lead. We know where this can lead. I mean, I was chilled to the bone yesterday. Many of you probably saw that meme of that person who was supposedly a fentanyl dealer being like, it was a cartoon that had been tweeted out by the White House. And it reminded me of some of the darkest cartoons that came out of Germany in the 30s. I mean, this is not what we're about. And I look, the American people are good people. I firmly, we are a good country, and we are better than this. And I think that with the reporting that you all can do, the tools that you have to make the public aware of what's going on and be very precise with language, I think people will understand, because as Todd pointed out, I don't think this is what the American people envisioned. I think it's pretty clear that what the American people voted for in November last year was a secure border and to lower the price of milk and eggs. I think it's pretty clear that's what they voted for. I think what people are going to be surprised at, and what they are surprised at, whoever they voted for, is when they see their next door neighbor being picked up, or when they hear that their doctor has been removed, can't get back in the country, or the person that takes care of their mom in assisted living has been deported or detained. That is a surprise to, I think, a lot of people, and a shock. And that's how this hits home with the American people.
Yeah, I agree. It will take a while. I've been seeing reports, and only the actual stories get to people. For example, this couple from Colombia who were 35 years in this country, no crime, no nothing. They were deported suddenly, and their children are left like, they were treated like animals. This is what they're talking about. So the more we tell the stories to our audiences, the more we're going to be able to spread the word on this. Henrietta was asking, would Pacific Islanders coming from American territories like Samoa and Tonga who are living in the US be affected? It's possible, right?
Yeah, I'm happy to answer to the degree I can, and the answer is it's possible. I mean, we have heard reports of, for example, Native Americans being targeted, right? Like the administration has no interest in being precise. The administration has no interest in due process in the rights of individuals. The administration's only view on immigration, as was laid out, was exclusion, deportation, is harm. So unfortunately, it's quite possible that all sorts of folks who normally would not fall within the scope of immigration law or immigration enforcement are going to be targeted, are going to be at risk, even in contravention of, current law or the protections of the Constitution.
Okay. Oh, there's so many questions. Natalie says, can we talk about the chilling effect for students at universities, CSU and beyond? There's been very, I don't know, disturbing arrests, like the one from the Turkish, to the Turkish student. I don't know if you guys saw the video. She was being arrested by people, by officials with their faces covered, which is something I do not understand. If you're an ICE agent, why would you cover your face? Can someone answer this?
I think they take the position that it's for their own security. They don't want to be doxxed and that sort of thing. Look, we could debate whether or not they should cover their face, but I think the real issue is using a vague, and this is what I assume they're using. I haven't seen the charge in that case, but using a vestige of the Cold War vague foreign policy provision. The provision that they're using that in that case, I believe, and in the case of the Columbia student, Mr. Khalil, and then in other cases, is a provision in the law that says that a person can be deported if the Secretary of State here, Rubio, makes a determination that their activities or presence, just their presence in the United States, creates a potentially serious foreign policy consequence, whatever that means. It's very vague. And in fact, that provision was up before the United States Court of Appeals for the Second Circuit in New York, and it was struck down by a federal district judge. named Mrs. Judge Barry, who happens to be Donald Trump's sister. Now, it was reversed on other grounds, and the only case that at least I know of where it was used before had occurred during the, I believe it was the Clinton administration, when when the target was a former attorney general of Mexico who was wanted in Mexico on a number of different charges, and Mexico expressed concern, and there was a distinct foreign policy reason. I'm not saying it was what used right or not, but here, what is the foreign policy reason? Rubio has to articulate that, and the way this works is once he articulates his foreign policy reason, as long as it's reasonable, which means whatever he says, that they'll defer to him, that's enough to present to an immigration judge to have this person deported. So my point is, why would you use this provision when the effect is to chill First Amendment free speech rights? If there's something that Khalil did, or that this woman from Tufts did, that violates our law, or that was materially supporting terrorists or something like that, we have provisions that cover that. We don't need to use a vague foreign policy provision, the effect of which is to put a serious chill on free speech.
Well, she wrote a piece, Rumeysa Öztürk, I'm sorry if I'm butchering that. She was the Tufts University doctoral student. She had written a pro-Palestinian piece. That's
Right.
all she did.
That's what the press is
what we know.
reporting. That's right. So my point is, if she did something wrong, what is it? Is it that? If it's that, then boy, I mean, they need to justify why they are using a provision like this. It's only supposed to be used sparingly, not because, and it says specifically, Pilar, the legislative history, the reasoning behind this statute, which was put down in writing by members of Congress, is that if somebody simply disagrees, that's not enough. And we could agree with her, we can disagree with her. That's not enough to put her and arrest her off the street.
So and there's a question in the chat from Henrietta. She says, you're asking us to put out the truth of what the administration is doing, but journalists themselves are being targeted. So what would you recommend for us to protect ourselves? So if I'm a green card holder, or even if I'm a naturalized citizen, and I report something they don't like, with this context, I may be afraid that something may happen to me.
No. Look, I share your anxiety. I'm an attorney. I'm an immigration attorney. I'm the past president of the Immigration Lawyers Association, and we've been targeted directly last Friday night in a directive. I've never been anxious about speaking publicly. I'll admit I'm anxious now. But I think, my father fled the Nazis as a Jew, and he didn't flee the Nazis. My grandfather didn't outsmart the Nazis to get to the United States so that I could cower in fear. And I think the best remedy to this kind of thing is sunlight and speaking out and being public. That's the best protection. I have worked with people in totalitarian regimes, and that's always been the best. That has always been the best cover. The best protection is public and honesty. Look, you have to make your own decisions as a journalist. I mean, I can't fault you if you say you don't want to do this work anymore. That is your choice. I would respect it. But, I'm no rabbi and I'm no priest, but there's a saying that I can't get out of my head since this all started. And it comes from Rabbi Hillel from the Middle Ages. And he said, if I am not for myself, who will be for me? And if I'm only for myself, what am I? And if not now, when? And that is the moment, in my opinion, that we are in American history. So every one of us has to decide for ourselves and how we are going to look at ourselves 20 years from now and ask, what did we do?
Thank you, David. Thank you for that. So it comes to mind the question, who is safe, right? If legal permanent residents, green cards can be taken away for X number of reasons that the administration is giving. Naturalized citizens, are we safe? I'm a naturalized citizen. someone who owes back taxes or failed to show up for a traffic violation? Is that something that is the foreseeable future that we should be looking at? Can something like this happen?
Yeah,
So, oh, go ahead, Todd.
Martin, you want to go ahead first?
Well, what I'll say, I just want to reiterate what has been said, right? Which is one of the reasons, even if only for self-interest, it is extremely important to recognize the need to support the rights of immigrants and for others who may be disfavored or targeted, because there is no stopping point, right? If the administration is willing to violate principles of due process, is willing to violate the Constitution when it comes to immigrants, there is no reason there's no reason to think that anybody is going to be exempt from that. So if only for self-interest, it's important to continue to advocate and to continue to push back against overreaches and violations of individual rights. But I'll pass it over.
No, yeah. I mean, I think about in terms of what they're trying to do to people who are here in a couple of different levers that pull. We talked about stripping away status. We talked about taking due process away to speed up deportations. They're also putting way more money into this, leveraging efforts, right? Every one ICE agent, there's 1,000 other sworn law enforcement officers. But a really big lever is making people's day-to-day lives worse and harder and more restrictive and spreading fear and propaganda. And this is hard, and it is a great question. But if you create a situation where immigrants and immigrant communities don't have access to education or are too scared to go to school, they don't have access to basic health care, they're going to be sicker. They don't have access to housing. They don't have access to jobs. They are terrified to come into contact with the basic aspects of law enforcement. They can't drive. You're going to have people who we're not going to be able to tell this incredible story about immigrants and immigration being this amazing benefit to America in the same way. It's going to feel harder because the act of immigration is incredible. Immigrants have done such amazing beneficial work to the United States and been such a benefit. But that's harder when you take away these opportunities to people. We all know that. There's no superpowers involved here. And so fear is a force multiplier. Chaos is a force multiplier. And the very fact that you called that great question, Pilar, of who is safe, is a thing I think we have to confront head on, because in a world in which schools and immigrant communities see people not show up, that fear can have an incredibly chilling and detrimental effect. And so I both think it is important to acknowledge and call the question. And also we have to do all of our work so that we don't find ourselves in a downward spiral of these downward pressures, of these doom loops, where instead of being able to say, how are we all going to be better off by immigrants doing this incredible thing of coming to this country and lifting us all up, we can't be in a situation where people are pushed down there. So it's such an important question.
Thank you. Zenobia, I want to give you the last word on that. Who do you think is safe from this dragnet?
Well, I agree with what Martin, Todd, and David have said. You know, I'm a lawyer, an immigration lawyer. I have a target on my back. I know that. I was also a journalist before I became a lawyer. So, you know, telling the truth, seeking justice is what governs my life. I can speak for myself. You know, if you come for me, be my guest. I'm ready for that, right? Because I know very well if I'm not speaking up for the people who are not in the best position to speak up, no one is going to speak up for me when it comes my turn. So, you know, immigrants are being used to test the rule of law. So that's why, you know, this is the moment for us to push back so that it doesn't get further and further. You know, and I think Steve Miller has this thinking that just shoot first, you know, and then figure out later whether it's legal, whether it's defensible. So they're at the shoot first time. So it is time for us to block as much as possible so that we can protect as many people as possible and to protect our system of rule of law and our constitutional principle. None of that is negotiable. You know, without rule of law, then, you know, we are just like a banana republic. Why are we even here? So I think that's important to remember. It's all our job to protect, the rule of law, the democracy that we believe in, and we may be one tiny pebble on the road to block it, but together we could be a big boulder. So, and that is not to minimize, your anxiety and your fear. I hear that, I feel that too every day. But for me, this is my calling to do this work, and I'm not backing down.
Thank you. Thank you, Zenobia. Thank you, Todd, David, Martin. Thank you for being with us and sharing your expertise. The hour is over, and we could continue on, but thank you for being with us. Thank you for our colleagues. Will continue to talk about this subject, and have a good weekend.